Hi, I'm Paul Kramer for Workshop Records, and this is Country Guitar Clinic. In the next hour or so, we'll be analyzing a style of lead electric guitar playing, which for lack of a better term I'm going to refer to as the hot Nashville style. It's a style that's clean, it's up-tempo, it's exciting, it's precise. It's also fairly challenging, so be advised that the material in this tape is of an intermediate to an advanced level of difficulty. Most of our time will be devoted to taking you through 10 solos over basic 1-4-5 chord progressions at normal and slow tempos, analyzing and demonstrating the various licks used. But before we do that, I'm going to outline a series of 10 ideas or guidelines or principles in order to place these licks into some sort of frame of reference to help you understand the logic behind the licks. Then when we get into the actual solos, we'll be seeing some concrete examples of how these ideas are applied. But the very first order of business is to very quickly show you my setup here. First, I have a Tokai Stratocaster copy electric guitar, and as you can see, I've had some fairly extensive customizing done on this guitar, the main feature of which is this Seymour Duncan Telecaster pickup, which I've had put into the bridge position, and I'll be using that a lot during this tape to get that nice biting Telecaster kind of a sound. And the custom work on this guitar was done by a very fine luthier from Chicago whose name is Ed Reynolds. Secondly, I have a Mesa Boogie Mark IIc amplifier here, which I like very much, and I'll be using it entirely in the rhythm mode for the purposes of this tape. Third, on the bottom of the rack here, I have a Korg SDD 3000 digital delay, and I'll have this set at 125 milliseconds for a nice kind of a slapback effect, also with a touch of modulation mixed in. Then we have a Yamaha SPX 90 with, this is set to a nice room reverb program. And finally, on the floor there you see we have a Boss Compression Sustainer, which is a CS2. Now then, before we do anything else, let's get in tune. Here's the low E string. Then we have the A. Then the D. Next, the G. Then the B string. Finally, the high E string. Now then, part of the process of becoming a complete musician in any field is practicing to acquire the necessary technical mastery of your instrument in the style that you've chosen, and country, again, is no different. There's a great deal of time and effort involved, as I'm sure you know, in just training the muscles of your fingers to behave properly. And this involves practicing scales and doing exercises and copying licks off of records and bending strings over and over again until you get them in tune. This is what is referred to as getting your chops together. But there's more to become to real musical situations in ways that are tasteful and intelligent and creative. So with that in mind, I've developed a set of ideas to help you in analyzing and improving your own solos. Don't regard this as a list of rigid do's and don'ts. You don't have to use each and every one of these concepts in every single solo. We're going to start with from the rather general ideas and sort of an overall philosophy of tasteful soloing, and we'll move on to more specific ideas that deal with stylistic points of country guitar playing. So here are 10 principles for tasteful and effective soloing. Number 1, repeat yourself. As I'm sure you've heard before, repetition is basic to all forms of music, and with country it's no different. One of the nice techniques we're going to be looking at is through varying and repeating a given phrase or lick, how to add interest to our solos and to make them more musical. Number 2, think in terms of phrases. Instead of having your solos come out as one long blur of notes, leave a pause every once in a while, if only to let the listener know that you're not just trying to overwhelm them with an endless stream of hot licks. Number 3, pace yourself. To me, the most satisfying solos are those that have a nice kind of dramatic flow to them and that have a sort of a logical build-up to a climax. And this is particularly important when you're playing a longer solo. Number 4, play melodically. When you have a song that has a distinctive melody, it's very nice to incorporate that melody into your solo. Maybe not for the whole solo, but at least long enough to establish its identity and its importance to the song. Number 5, try rhythmic surprises. Accenting a note or ending a phrase on a beat or a half a beat that is normally not accented is a very effective tool in phrasing. And we'll be seeing some examples of how to use this as we go on. Number 6, vary your choice of modes. There's no rule that says you have to begin a solo in a given scale or mode and stay in that same mode through the entire solo. In country, we're dealing mainly with straight major chords, so a lot is left up to you, up to your own personal interpretation as to what to play over them. And one common theme we'll be examining and re-examining in this course is the use of varying the third and the seventh of the scale. Sometimes we'll be using a major third in combination then with a flatted third, and sometimes we'll be varying from a major seventh to a flatted seventh. Number 7, play outside. And I don't use the term outside in the sense that you may have heard a jazz player use, for example, where outside means getting totally away from the harmonic contours or confines of the song. But instead, what I'm suggesting is that sometimes it's nice to emphasize a note or a group of notes that is normally not emphasized against a given chord. And one example of this will be the use of extended chords, which we'll explain a little bit later, but basically the idea is to add a feeling of tension and release throughout your solos. Number 8, be flexible in approaching bar lines. And sometimes it's nice to anticipate a chord change by playing something that implies that change a beat or two, or sometimes even a whole measure before that change actually takes place. And we'll be seeing some examples of this too. Number 9, use mixed articulation. While a little bit of what we're going to do involves straight flat picking technique, particularly very fast passages, most of the time we'll be using the pick in combination with the middle or second finger and the third finger of the right hand. We'll also be seeing the use of a lot of left-hand techniques in sounding notes, and these include hammer-ons, pull-offs, slides, and bends. And the basic idea here is that we're going to vary the kind of attack or articulation used in sounding notes to create variety. Number 10, emphasize the contrast between staccato and legato playing. And this is kind of a corollary of number 9, the use of mixed articulation. As I'm sure you've heard or should know by now, legato refers to playing passages of notes that run smoothly into one another with little emphasis on the pick attack. So as you might expect, these will be mainly executed by the left hand with the techniques that I've just described. Staccato, on the other hand, refers to a more clipped sound where the goal is to try to keep the notes from ringing together, and there's more emphasis on the pick attack. And that might be using the flat pick, or it might be sort of popping the string a little bit with the middle finger. And staccato also involves the use of some more difficult techniques of string damping, either with the left or the right hand. And we'll explain more about string damping as we encounter some specific examples. But for now, let's wind up our discussion of the 10 principles of tasteful and effective soloing and get into some actual solos. Here's here's that same solo now at slow speed. So this solo provides a great example of the idea of mixed articulation that I was referring to earlier. Some of the notes are played with the pick, while others are played with the middle finger of the right hand, and still others are executed with left-hand techniques such as hammering on or pulling off or a slide. And one common pattern that emerges in this solo for using the pick and the middle finger is that when you play a lick that rocks back and forth between adjacent strings, we use the pick for the lower of the two notes and the middle finger for the higher of the two notes. And I'll give you an example of this focusing on my right hand here so you can see. Just play the beginning of the solo over again and you can see that technique at work. As such. And another a case of using the pick and middle finger, this time on the same string, occurs at the end of measure 4. We see a note or a line where first is picked and then the middle finger sounds a note and then we pull off. And it goes like that. Just as kind of a sidebar here, I'd like to point out the use of the compressor in this kind of a style of playing. Since we're varying the dynamic attack so much, the compressor helps us to keep everything at roughly equal relative volume so that some notes don't jump out too much and others get lost. But at the same time, the dynamic variety of attack is preserved. So it's a good idea to use a compressor. I prefer using one. Next, we're going to look at some examples of phrasing and pacing in this solo. Throughout the first 4 bars, we see a series of distinct phrases emerging there, and these are set off in a couple of different ways. First, by the use of pauses, and we have pauses in the middle of bar 1, at the beginning of measure 3, in the middle of measure 4, and again in the middle of measure 5. Also, we have the use of droned notes, and again, I'll show you what we're doing there. This kind of thing. And we have that on the D string and the G string here. And this just kind of also helps to break up the solo a little bit and give a little bit of room to breathe. Both these techniques, in fact, keep it from sounding as though we're just wailing away through the entire solo. Finally, I'd like to point out the use of a little device that occurs at the beginning of measure 5. And on the very first beat of this measure, against what is an A chord here, we sound staccato B note, and then immediately after, a half beat later, we play the A note. And this is a little bit of a surprise here, because the normal expectation would be that that very accented beat would have a note from the A chord, either an A or a C sharp or an E. So it's a nice little device that sort of defies the usual expectations of the listener and sort of adds some musical interest there. Here it is at half speed. In this solo, we see some of the same concepts that we also saw in the first solo. The idea of mixed articulation using the pick in combination with the middle finger. And we see one additional case, or a different type of way that this can be done in this solo, and that is in bars 5 and also in bar 7 we see cases where the middle finger actually strikes 2 notes in a row on the same string, and that looks like this. So we see, again, as we go into the bend, right there we've got 2 notes in a row there, and also right there. And then again, those 2 notes again struck by the middle finger. And I'd like to take a look at this bend in a little bit greater detail to explain the idea of right-hand staccato string damping. And basically what this involves is, after you've sounded a note on a string, you use the same finger that sounded the note to damp it out as you're sounding the next note on the next string. And for example, now as you see, as I hit that note on the E string, I brought the pick down on the B string to mute it out. And there, as I go back, as the lick moves back to the B string, I've used the middle finger to mute out the note on the E string. And this concept applies very often in these type of situations. Okay, I'd like to take a look at some of the mode changes that are used in this solo, both by varying the third of the scale and also by varying the seventh. First of all, in the first measure, we see we've got a major third, which we slide into the first time, and then we hammer on into it from the minor third. And then in the second measure, we've got a choked flatted third, which adds some variety to the mode that we're using here. And by choked, I mean that we bend it, pull it up a little bit, but it's a bend of less than a half a step. Okay, also in measures 1 through 4, we're using the flatted seventh of the scale, which is F in the G scale. And then in bars 5 and 6, when the progression goes to the D chord, we see that that F becomes an F sharp, which fits a little bit smoother with the harmonic contours of the D chord, as that is D, F sharp, and A. In measure 7, we've got a technique of anticipating a chord change, this time from the 5 chord back to the 1 chord. And what this involves, as I explained earlier, anticipating a chord change is we're playing things that actually suggest G more than they do D, but while the chord progression is still in D, so it gives a little bit of tension there. You can see that that first lick emphasizes the G a little bit more, but we're playing it over D, so it has a nice sort of tension to it. I'd like to raise a technical point and backtrack a little bit to bar 2, where we've got that triplet, which comes immediately after that choked flatted third. And the next 5 notes after that will be all picked, and there will be 2 upstrokes in a row in there as well. The latter 2 notes, or the last 2 notes of that triplet, are going to be both played with an upstroke, which isn't as uncomfortable as it sounds because we're playing them on first the 4th string and then the 5th string. So it's okay. Is that clear? Let me show that one more time. All right. Finally, this solo is a very good example of the idea of phrasing and pacing. We've got some pauses at the end of measure 4, also near the end of measure 6. And we also have, I think it's a well-paced solo, and it has a nice dramatic finish to it with these pull-off triplets. Makes for a nice, satisfying conclusion. And speaking of conclusions, that concludes solo number 2. Here's that solo at slow speed. Now then, it's fairly clear that this is a very challenging solo, and it's got a lot of different ideas and concepts happening in it, so we'll just take it one step at a time and start at the very beginning. And the very beginning in this case happens to be a clawed double stop, and what I mean by the term clawed is we're using the third finger now in conjunction with the middle finger to simultaneously strike a pair of strings, in this case the G and the B string together. And you can see in measure 1 and measure 3 we have a banjo roll happening there. That's sounds like a banjo anyway, and it's basically a ringing roll that's played with the all three fingers on the right hand, or the pick and two fingers, in kind of a forward motion. And that roll, which looks like this, and then that roll is repeated in measure 3. And it's also varied in measures 2 and 4 slightly, and altogether that phrase comes off something like this, showing you once again. At any rate, in bar 5, then we're going to be going into a section of almost all flat pick notes, except for a couple pull-offs, which give it some feeling of variety to it. And beginning with a low C note, which is droned here in kind of a rapid-fire technique. And the important thing there is to just get your pick right into that rhythmic groove and just groove along with it. Measure 7, we're going back into the pick combined with the middle finger technique, and we'll be staying with that technique through the rest of the solo there. In bar 8, we see an example of varying the mode. First we have the use of the major third, then the flatted third, and then a choked flatted third, as well as a choked fourth note there as well. And it looks like this. Then in measure 9, we go to the 5 chord, and here we've got a couple rhythmic surprises. First of all, the way that this lick starts is fairly syncopated, so that's kind of a surprise in itself. It sort of goes against the rhythmic grain, as it were. And also, this phrase represents the end of a phrase that was begun back in the middle of bar 7. And so this is sort of an unusual place to end a phrase, since it sort of ends right in mid-measure. Most phrases normally will end at the beginning of a measure, for example, or the end, but here we're ending it in the middle. Okay, in bar 10, another case of varying the mode, this time with the 7th note of the scale. This will be over the 5 chord. First we see the use of the natural 7th, and then we see the use of a choked flatted 7th, and then we see a straight flatted 7th as part of a pentatonic lick, which sort of anticipates the G chord by 2 beats. And that's if you didn't know, by pentatonic we mean it's sort of a blues scale which has 5 notes, and those being the 1, flatted 3rd, 4th, 5th, flatted 7th, and back to the 1. Okay, in bar number 11, we've got a slight pause at the very beginning of the measure, and then we see a case where we slide up a couple of positions to double a note on the high G string. This kind of a thing. In bar 12, we've got the use of a couple non-chord tones placed on accented beats over the 1 chord, over the G chord. And for example, on the very first 2 accented beats of that measure, we've got a C and an A. And those are resolved very quickly, but there's a sort of a fleeting tension there that's introduced. And I just like the feel of that, and I think that by experimenting with licks of that kind, you can add some of that flavor to your own playing. And also notice at the end there we're varying the 7th again, this time over the 1 chord. And as we're ascending in that lick, we're using the natural 7th, and then as we descend, we're using the flatted 7th. And you can make that into a nice little formula or whatever if you like. It's a nice technique to vary the scale as we ascend and descend. It works well also with the 3rd, and I'll leave it to you to try that on your own. that solo again at slow speed. Now this, if you didn't already know it, is a melody solo for the song Wabash Cannonball, and it illustrates an approach for songs of this type and the fact of the way it's constructed. And basically I'm going to take this and we'll use it as a model for melody solos. In the first couple bars we're stating the melody fairly closely. And as we go on, as we get into say measure 3, we're embellishing it a little more with some nice bends and things. Then we restate the melody as it begins to repeat in measure 5, and this time we're varying it a little bit and throwing in a few different licks. Then as we get towards the end of the solo, we're leaving the melody all together and playing things of a more personal nature, just whatever you feel like. That's the place for hot licks, basically, at the end of a solo like that. This solo also is a good illustration of some nice string bending licks. In measure 1, we've got an example of a bend which is held throughout measure 1, or the remainder of measure 1, and then released in measure 2, but not before we use some nice right hand damping technique with our middle and third fingers, both this time. And I'd like to show you how this damping works here. We go. There's the bend, and you'll notice that by the time we've struck that second string, we've damped out the bent note. Then next, we're going to use our third finger and also damp with it. So we're using the third finger and the middle finger right in a row, and each time we use that same finger to damp out the notes we've just played, and then we release the bend. And in measure 3, we've got a different kind of a bend. This time we're just using our index finger, which is a little bit difficult because there's no fingers behind it to give it additional power. But instead of bending up or towards us, we're going to be pulling away from us, so that makes it a little bit easier. So we have something like this. And it looks like that. Then in measures 5 and 6, we have some more bending and some more damping. It looks like this. Same old bending or damping techniques there. Now here we're going to be damping again with the middle and the third finger. That's a double bend in measure 6 there, and we're bending the G string there a whole step and the B string a half step. I use my third and fourth fingers here. If you want to, you can use your second and third fingers. It really doesn't matter. I find it comfortable to use third and fourth. And it sounds tricky to bend two notes at two different intervals, but really, if you keep the strings the same distance apart, it helps to keep them in tune for some reason. As you can see, I'm keeping the same interval, the same distance between the strings there. And then I'm repeating that same lick 2 frets up over the E chord. And one other thing I'd like to mention about this solo is the use of what I call ghost notes in measure 3. And for this technique, we're just lifting up on our left hand the index finger that's fretting the D string at the 2nd fret. We just lift it up slightly to mute out the note, and then we strike it twice, first with the pick and then with the middle finger of the right hand. So you get the feel of that sort of technique. And that brings us to the end of solo number 4. Here it is again at slower speed. Now this is a nice little rockabilly solo, and it serves as also a good study in the ideas of repetition and variation. If you notice in measures 1 and 2, we have a phrase that is then echoed, slightly varied in bars 3 and 4. And this phrase consisting of some nice clawed double stops there. Then in bar 5 and 6, we have a little phrase that sort of rocks back and forth between the pick in the right hand and the claw technique. And the thing to notice about this phrase is that it sort of is based on a 3-beat figure. And then it begins repeating. So it's got that nice element of syncopation working for it also. Bar 7, we've got a simple little comping figure that sort of breaks up the solo a little bit, just a straight double stop here, which is clawed, that type of thing, and gives the solo a little room to breathe. Then in measures 8 and 9, we've got another repeated figure, and this one's got a bit of a quirky rhythmic feel to it. Let's see. As it chokes, as it does, the third of both the D chord and the C chord there. And then at the end we've got a big finish. Again, for the idea of pacing, we've got this time picked triplets. First of all, we slide up from the C note, and actually we've got this is being played with the third finger there, and so we're going to do a slight adjustment of our left hand here. We're going to slide up to the 9th fret, and then the index finger will take over at the 8th fret to put us in position for this triplet, which is going to be picked. So it's going to be... And if you'll notice, there's a bit of a left hand jumping around there too. You need a little bit of agility there. But then again, you shouldn't feel like your left hand always has to be rooted with the index finger on the same fret. It should be fairly maneuverable. And as far as the picking goes, it's down, up, all the way through it. Sometimes the upstrokes are going to be on accented beats, which might seem a little bit tricky. But just keep working at it, and you can cheat if you want and do it with just pull-offs, which is fine too. But let me show you one more time how that lick works and with the picking technique involved. And that does it for solo number 5. Here it is again, slowed down. And this little solo is kind of a string bending showcase. We're demonstrating various kinds of bends here. And the first kind I like to refer to as a unison bend, and we see that demonstrated in measures 1, again in measures 8 through 10. And the first case of that occurs here at we're at the 7th fret with our 3rd finger and the 5th fret with our 1st finger. We're bending the lower of the 2 notes up to the pitch of the higher of the 2 notes. It's a 1 fret bend, or a whole step. Now we do the same thing up 3 frets. And if you're not familiar with string bending technique, this is a real good way to start because it really lets you know if you're in tune right off the bat. It's a good way to double check yourself. You can see how that would be an advantage there. In measures 9 and 10, we've got this same type of bend, but this time we're going to start with the string bent and we're going to release it. So as we can see here, we have the first case. Well, actually, we start with that note on the G string is bent. So while we're setting up our positioning there, we need to bend that note in advance, and then we release it as part of the lick. Okay, then we also have some bends of much larger intervals, and namely the interval here is a sixth that we see beginning in measures 5 and going through measures 5 through 7. And another thing to notice about this particular series of bends is that it's a real nice example of a contrast between staccato and legato playing. For example, each bend, when it finishes up, it's not a distinct entity, but it sort of slides into the next set of bends, which gives it a real nice legato flavor at that point. But then as we move back and forth between the G string and the E string, we've got a nice string damping happening with our right hand there, so it looks like this. And you can see that when I finish each set of licks, that G string, the bend not only releases, but then without striking the note again with the pick, I just slide it up and then bend into the next note, and that gives it that real nice legato feeling. There's one other device I'd like to talk about in this solo, and that is in measures 2 and 3, at the end of measure 2 actually, in measure 3, we have the use of chromaticism and arpeggiation in close contrast. And if you didn't know chromaticism, that simply refers to playing notes that are a half step apart, and arpeggiation just refers to sort of spelling out chord tones. And so we have some very close intervals and then some very wide intervals. And the contrast between the two is what makes this lick unique. And let's see, it goes. So you see we have a chromatic lick, and then an arpeggio over a D9 chord, and then we're back to chromatic right there. So that wraps up solo 6. Let's move on. Here it is, slowed down. Notice that solo number 7 starts off with a classic case of repetition and variation for the first 3 measures. We see a triplet at the end of measure 3, which has a little bit of tricky picking technique to it. We're going to once again play 2 upstrokes in a row, the back part of this triplet, and this will involve switching around our basic pick direction for the next phrase, for the end of that phrase, so that instead of having the emphasis being down, up, we're going to be actually playing up, down, and we're going to focus in a little bit on the right hand so you can see that, beginning with measure 3. So that pick direction there is something to take note of. In measure 5, we have our first example of the use of extended chords. And let me explain a little bit of how these are derived and what it means, extended chord. We're in A here, so we'll take our A chord as an example. As you know, a major chord is made up of the first, third, and fifth notes of the scale. We can make that a 7th chord by adding in the flatted 7th note. So we have 1, 3, 5, flat 7, and it's perfectly normal, and this is what we're going to do, in fact, to keep on extending that right on up from 1, 3, 5, 7 to 9, and since 8 is the same as 1, A being the same as A, 9 is actually the 2nd note of the scale. It's just put way up on top of the chord form there. So we have 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. We can keep right on extending that to 11, which is actually the 4th note of the scale, and 13, which is actually the 6th note of the scale. So altogether it sounds like this. Now, the way that we're going to use these is to sort of further the idea of tension and release in our solos. And if you'll notice, if we play some of the upper reaches of that triad over a straight A scale, it can get, or a straight A chord, it can get to sounding a little strange. And that's just the tension that we're putting in there. The key is to resolving it quickly enough so that we don't become, or the phrase doesn't become too uncomfortable to listen to. And the overall idea here is that we're creating kind of a harmonic divergence, or whatever I guess you could say, moving in and out of the harmonic flow here. And so let's look at the rolls we have here specifically. We start off with sort of a staccato roll, which involves the third, the fifth, and the flat seventh of the A chord. And notice this time that we're going to be doing a little bit of left hand damping. And that just means that we're going to pick up the fingers of our left hand after we've struck each string just enough to sort of mute those notes out, just to keep them from ringing together. So we start off with that 3, 5, flat 7 roll, and then we move up to a flat 7, 9 kind of figure, again with the left hand damping. And then we resolve it back to sliding into the third and playing the fifth with it. So the tension is resolved in that way. Okay, moving along into measure 7, we have a pause there and then an abrupt choking of the flatted third note, which is held out a little bit, and that brings us into measure 8 and into the 5 chord, which I'll show you that little lick over the 5 chord real quickly, and that goes like this. And that brings us right into the ending. We've got kind of a strange little bender lick here, which goes like this. Now, what we're doing here is the third finger is grabbing the E string at the 10th fret, and as we bend up, we kind of grab the B string at the same time with the same finger at the same fret, and the next thing we do is going to be to mute the E string with the third finger, and then to grab onto the B string and then release it. And oddly enough, this seems to come out in tune most of the time. And also notice that this last little lick is played entirely over the pentatonic scale there. So the important thing there is to just note the role of the left and right hands. The left hand, the third finger, grabbing both those strings, and the right hand damping. And also notice that here we're bending the flatted 7th note of the scale up to the 1, and then as we grab the note on the B string, we're releasing the 5th into the 4, because we're going to see other cases of this lick where we're actually using different notes. But that about does it for solo number 7, so let's move right along. Here's solo 8 slowed down. Now then, this solo should provide some reinforcement for some of the ideas that we've been seeing all along. We've got some new licks here, but basically similar ideas. So I'm just going to take you through a few of the new ideas that we have here. In measure 1, we see a repeated roll, which is ringing. This is a fairly common, kind of a rock and roll sounding lick, which has got a unison bend and is played at the 7th and the 5th frets here. And that type of thing. In measures 2 and then again in measure 3, we have the contrast between third and the flat third. In measure 5, we have an example of an extended 4 chord, and the notes here being the third, the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th notes of a D. That'd be a D9th arpeggio. And we're doubling the 9th with the unison bend there, so it looks like that type of a thing. Then in measure 7, we've got a bit of a pause there that gives the solo a little bit of room to breathe and contributes to the overall pacing. In measure 10, we've got an example of anticipating the return to the 1 chord. And here we're still in E, but we're playing something that sounds more like A. And then that brings us into another big finished triplet ending. Only this time the articulation is going to be different yet. Instead of playing with pull-offs or with all pick notes, this time we're going to use mixed articulation with some pull-offs, some pick notes, and some notes articulated by the middle finger. So it goes. And that's it for solo number 8. And here's solo 9, slow down. Now, and this is a fairly difficult solo, but there are some familiar aspects of it which you should have begun to notice by now. One would be the example of phrasing and the pauses that occur at fairly regular intervals here in measures 4 and 8 and 12. But they're not simply your garden variety pause, which starts at the beginning of the measure. Each has a little bit of a twist to it. And for example, in measure 4, the way that phrase ends on the non-accented beat there, I find that to be particularly appealing. And in measure 8, we find the phrase ending on the second beat of the measure. Let's see, that goes. Instead of just playing, could have done that, but makes it a little bit different and just sort of defies the audience's expectation. Like so. Then the same thing is true in measure 12, where again we end on the second beat of the measure. And we also end on kind of a funky note there, that flatted third. Now let's look at measures 5 and 6, where we have an extended lick over the 1 chord, and this is my my new favorite lick here that we've got here. It's a nice lick. It's very sort of symmetrical sounding and looking also, and it involves some left hand damping, which you should find a little bit challenging. To begin with, it starts off pretty much with an 11th arpeggio. As the pickup notes outline the 1, 3, and 5 notes, and then we move up to the 7, 9, and 11 notes. And again, we're going to be lifting each finger of the left hand in turn as it sounds its notes to keep it sounding crisp and staccato. And then this time, instead of just playing a straight roll and then sliding up, we go back to the pick note on the D string one time. So it's, and then we slide up, resolving that to the 3rd and the 5th. And then we repeat that same sort of position there on the high set of strings, this time sliding from the 7th to the 9th fret on the G string, and coming back again on the G string as the 4th note, and this time we slide up from the flatted 7th to the 1st and the 3rd. So there we're taking a 5, 7, 9 arpeggio and sliding it back up to the against the 1 and the 3rd. Now in measure 9, we see a whole section of flat-picked material, and begins with a little lick here that not only is it kind of challenging to play, but makes a good exercise. And I want to stop there for a second and talk about the use of this F note right here, where we see. And as you probably know, there's no F in a straight A major scale. This gives it kind of a augmented sound, since the F is sort of the sharp 5 note in an A major scale. And it sort of introduces a note of tension here, which is then resolved by moving us into the 4 chord immediately afterwards. So. And this is a fairly common device that jazz players have been using this for a long time, and I find it works pretty well in a country context also. This little augmented lick, getting us, it's a kind of a nice thing to do over a 1 chord where you want a kind of a 7th or a dominant kind of a sound. Instead of playing just 7th, you could play an augmented to get us into a 4 chord. It also works over a 5 chord when you're trying to get back to a 1. You can sort of add that in there sometimes. And that's it for solo number 9. And here it is slowed down. Now then, this again is a very difficult solo, and but you should notice some common patterns here and some of the same ideas that we've been seeing all along, and namely the ideas of repetition and variation, phrasing and pacing, and the variation in modes. And since we've got a lot of other material to cover here, I'm going to let you perform your own analysis on this solo with regard to those ideas. First of all, in measure 1, we start off on a low B. This song is in the key of B. And this is kind of a rapid-fire triplet here. This is all done with the pick. And the important thing, again, is just to keep the down-ups going steady. You're going to see it'll be down, up, down, then it'll be up, down, up, then it'll be down, up, down, etc., etc. And measure 5, we've got a triplet bend here with kind of a double stop, a claw action here. But this this lick is actually harder than it, or it's not as hard as it sounds. What we do here is we cheat a little bit and we throw in the use of the pick with the claw double stops, and in that way we kind of keep it from having to use the claw exclusively. So it's really easier than it sounds. Etc. It's really easy to give it a good staccato feel when you're alternating between the pick and the claw. Measure 12, we've got a left-hand shift there that I'd like to demonstrate for you because it's a little bit tricky, just to put you in the right position. We move into that lick by through this sliding lick. And here's the lick in measure 12, where we slide into it with the second finger to the 7th fret on the G string, and then we hit this note on the B string with our little finger, and then we take over with the index finger on the note that we just hit with the second finger so that we could reach up a little higher. So it looks like this. Okay, then the next measure, 13, we have what's an example of what is called sweep picking. And this is basically using the pick to an upstroke kind of a motion, while at the same time damping out two strings with the left hand. Actually, with one finger, we're going to be damping out the G and the B string by just leaning the third finger back and playing the 9th fret of the 4th string. And we'll do this kind of, let's see, you can hear that kind of upstroking motion there. And I'm going to show you this now from both hands, this whole little lick. First we'll look at the left hand. And now we'll jump back and look over at the right hand. So you see we're sort of alternating the use of the claw, and then with that sweep picking in it gives it a real nice funky kind of staccato feel. Okay, up to measure 14, we've got an extended run there over the 1 chord, which is the arpeggio here is flat 7, 9, 11. And that then resolves in measure 15. In measure 17 and 18, we've got a series of bends that again illustrates the idea of contrasting the feel of staccato with legato, and it does that very nicely. And basically, here's what it sounds like. Whoops. There's a fret off there. But anyway, you can see that the way that we release the bend, and then all in the same motion we slide back and bend into the next note, all without the benefit of a pick attack. Measure 19. We've got an extended lick over the 5 chord, and if we outline this as an arpeggio over an F sharp chord, we've got the 5th note of the F sharp chord, then the flat 7th, then the 9, then the 11, then the 13, all in a row like that. Then in measure 21, we've got kind of another rapid fire double stop bend. This time we're just using the claw here. And so that gives it a nice staccato sound. Moving up to measure 22, we see a real oddball little lick. I think I have to give Ray Flatt credit for inventing this. I think he was the first one to do it. And it involves using like 3 different left-hand techniques in a row without benefit of the pick attack, and sets up a real nice contrast between staccato and legato, like this. First we have a hammer, then we have a slide, then we have a bend. So the whole phrase is. Finally, in the last bar, we have another example of that wild double bend that's all done with one finger. This time we're on the 14th fret, and here again we bend up the E string with the 3rd finger and grab onto the B string at the same time and release it. And in the, between the 2 notes, of course, we need to damp with our right hand. And note that this time the bend is on the E string is from the 5th note of the scale up to the 6th, and back on the B string it releases from the 3rd to the 2nd. This brings us to the close of Country Guitar Clinic. I hope you found the ideas and guidelines that I've outlined here to be useful in recognizing some basic patterns in these and other solos. You may find yourself attracted to certain concepts more than others here, and that's perfectly fine. That's what helps to make your style different than someone else's. Also, I hope that you'll work with the actual solos enough to be able to play them comfortably, although it's perfectly fine to break them down into their individual licks for use in solos of your own creation. By the same token, if you have difficulty in executing certain licks, keep working at it, but don't let yourself become frustrated. Many times, licks that seem to be impossible to play are much easier if you give them a break, say for a month or so, and then come back to it after a while, meanwhile working on other aspects of your own playing. The important thing is keep learning, keep playing, and have fun.